Welcome to Entromy's Private Equity Impact Series, where we bring you real stories from the field that showcase how data, insight, and advisory expertise converge to accelerate value creation with some of the largest private equity firms in the world. Today's conversation is about what happens when a private equity-backed company is moving at full speed through acquisitions, leadership transitions, and cultural change, and suddenly needs a clear baseline to align its leaders and employees. Planning for an exit in 12 to 18 months, this particular company sought out Entromy's data to uncover both strengths and hidden risks. We asked Rob Greenhalgh of Summit Leadership Partners to support this organization as they played a pivotal role in turning those insights into a concrete action plan. This use case shows how structured, nuanced insight coupled with expert delivery can shift a leadership team from reacting to change toward driving it with clarity and confidence. Let's dive in. Rob, thanks so much for joining me today. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
So I'd love to get started with kind of the most impactful point. Where in this engagement do you see that maybe something really clicked, this aha moment where maybe a data point that we surfaced helped shift the thinking in the conversation with the leadership team?
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Matt, for having me here. I'd say in this particular case, the aha was less one particular point and more when we just looked at thematically what was happening in the organization. And what I mean by that, in this particular case, had been a significant amount of leadership change at the top of the house. So the new CEO had been in place for about a year, maybe a little bit less than a year. A new CFO was in place, and a couple other management team members. And so when we looked at the data, there was significantly lower scores around strategic alignment and not only around the leadership team, but also the enterprise or the company's understanding of the strategic direction. Couple on top of that, there were a significant number of acquisitions that took place that were probably in varying degrees of being integrated. And so it became really, really apparent that one of the big actions coming out of the Entromy data was to at least provide more clarity into the organization about where the company was going, even if it wasn't completely figured out in terms of a formal strategy. And to look at ways to be able to cascade this information down into the organization. Very typical of any organization that's going through a significant amount of change in terms of structure, change in terms of leadership. And when we saw the interconnectedness or the potential interconnectedness of all of this, I think that was really kind of the aha moment about what actions need to come out of this work.
So Rob, I'd love to dive a little bit deeper into the client and maybe give a little bit of their background. Because
Sure.
so often when we think about the data and the reports and your job in interpreting that data, context plays such a key role. You have to be able to
Absolutely.
contextualize the data. And so could you walk us through some of the contextual items that really kind of laid the groundwork for your interpretation of the data?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I mentioned, we looked at the scores, both in terms of organizational health and the ENPS. In both cases, this particular company was in the lowest quartile. And so whenever you see that context always matters, but it matters like even more to try to get a sense of where is this coming from. So a little bit about this company. It's a manufacturing company, about 300 employees. As I mentioned previously, I think two of the big dynamics are one, significant change in terms of the leadership team. So new CEO, new CFO, new COO. So three of the biggest roles in an organization. And then a relatively large acquisition about 18 months ago that was still very much in the process of integration. So those particular dynamics, I think, contributed to some of the major themes I think that we'll get to that came out. And one of them I've mentioned previously, quite a bit of feedback, both in the comments and in the quantitative data around lack of clarity in the employee base about what direction the company was going in. Another piece that we saw that I thought was really interesting was also relatively low scores around senior leadership. And my hypothesis, and we talked about this a little bit, was that in the absence of information or in the absence of having much exposure to some of these new leaders, real questions around who are these leaders, where are they taking us, and just uncertainty about kind of what the future path of the organization was.
So Rob, when you're looking at this data and you're appreciating the organization for maybe where they are and where they're trying to go and how fast they're trying to get there, how did you see your role kind of fitting into this? And maybe the questions that you were asked to solve, how do you see those playing together?
How aligned are you on the go forward strategy and the value creation plan? And when we do this, in this particular case, this was a 1 hour debrief with the leadership team. The way that we like to continue this work with the teams that we work with, particularly in a situation like this, where I think it's really relevant, is to, spend half a day, 3/4 of a day starting with the leadership team to get really aligned around what the strategy or value creation plan is. I want to be very clear. I'm not suggesting like recreating the strategy. I'm suggesting making sure that it's articulated in a way where the leadership team understands it and is aligned around it. Step one. Step two is, to execute any strategy, there are interdependencies across the organization. So being able to really identify what are the key interdependencies to make this strategy happen when it turns to execution. And then thirdly is, how do we communicate this and align down into the organization? So I think Entromy is a great tool to identify where those opportunities exist. And then when we see the patterns that we saw in this particular case, the next step then is to say, hey, we are going to have a better sense about how to prioritize the opportunities that came out of the Entromy survey, understanding which ones have the biggest impact on what we're trying to do strategically, and how do we execute that strategy.
So Rob, when you think about integrating the Entromy findings with your own expertise, because you've been in this space for quite a while, giving great advice to lots of different private equity portcos, were there specific modules or data sets that you chose to focus on with this client?
Yep. I'm a big fan of at the overall scores. So I think the overall score section really gives the heat map of it. And when you look at that, particularly in this case, lots of red, which isn't to be expected, just kind of given how the organization is doing. Or what's going on at the organization. And so that's the place. Generally, when we're approaching this, we're trying to then say, okay, of all of these, for us, it's always a question of what matters and what's going to be most critical. And so while there can be a natural human tendency to try to boil the ocean and solve everything, which of these are most critical to where we are in our journey and where we're trying to take the organization? And so that's probably the first place that we start. Then in some cases, if there are particular, what I call like talent pools, functional areas that are critical to where the organization is going, and we see lower scores, to have a conversation around that. And in some cases, we suggest that go out and do focus groups. So let's give an example. Let's say particularly low scores, if they were coming out of the sales organization, and if after a conversation, there's still like lack of clarity about why that might be the case, or we're just, curious as we should be about that, we might suggest to the client, let's go, either the client or ourselves or a combination. Let's go do some focus groups and let's try to really double click and figure out what's really going on here. This particular function or these particular capabilities are key to our value creation plan. We're seeing lower scores there. Let's try to figure out what's going on there. Just kind of move away from, we can make lots of assumptions. Sometimes we just need to get more data. Obviously, peeling through the comments, the commentaries are really revealing. They bring the data to life. So we're always taking a look at those as well.
When you were presenting these findings to the CEO and even to that private equity team, did you notice that maybe any of the findings were a surprise to the folks that you were delivering this to? And how do you handle that if there is a surprise with those executives?
I would say in this particular case, they were not surprised. I felt like in this particular case, but I'll answer your question from maybe thinking about separate clients. But in this particular case, I thought it was kind of reaffirming of what they suspected, just given all the dynamics we've talked about, change in leadership, new acquisition. So lots of transformation going on at the organization. When there's a surprise in other situations, when there's a surprise about the data that they see, I'd say one, just kind of let them process. Right. One of the things we try not to do, especially in the initial debrief, is get too into problem solving. Right. It's very easy in initial debrief to lose sight of the forest through the trees. And I think we all, especially executives, have a tendency to want to try to solve things right away. And so what I'm trying to bring the team back to is, what is most important? Where are we going to get the most leverage in terms of focusing our attention? And so when they're surprised about the results, it's first like letting them just process it. And I think in terms of our role, being facilitative to help them kind of think through it, to say, hey, let's not view this as a report card. Let's use this as a way to generate some insights starting around this table. And if we can't figure those insights out around this table, then maybe we do need to go into the organization and try to understand this more. But, I think there's a natural tendency when you're surprised by negative data to kind of shut down or jump immediately into problem solving mode. In many cases, that can take you down the wrong path if you do it too quickly. And so we got to figure out, what's next step here to try to understand this data that is a surprise to us right now.
Yeah. So in that same line of thinking, Rob, I'm kind of curious, how do you end up prioritizing these next steps? There's probably a variety of recommended action items that come out of these, but I would assume that there takes a certain level of expertise to be able to prioritize this. At Entromy, we do want to make sure that those action items are prioritized based on the value creation plan. We feel like that is where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. But I'm kind of curious, how do you do that when you're talking to these executives?
Yeah. One, I think it's really difficult to do that in the initial debrief. And I know going into some of these debriefs, we have clients who want to have the plan baked by the end of the hour. I think in most cases, that's really difficult to do. So the way that we approach it is we'll typically to bring an executive leadership team together for half a day, 3/4 of a day, literally put the value creation plan up. It's like, let's start with this as being the anchor. And then, of course, going into the session, we will have done our analysis to try to start, creating our hypotheses about which pieces of data on the Entromy survey, especially where there's opportunities, are potentially going to impact the ability to execute. And so we'll share some of to get the conversation going, thoughts and thinking about that. And then ultimately we'll defer back to the leadership team. Do they agree? Do they disagree? Let's have a healthy debate about this. But ultimately the goal of a half day, 3/4 day session is to come out with as much alignment as you can about the particular actions that they're going to take, because the team believes they will have the biggest impact to either parts of the value creation plan that could be at risk because of some of the results, or ways to kind of accelerate the ability to execute the value creation plan.
So, Rob, when you're thinking about them implementing some of these recommendations that you've made, how are we going to be able to measure the impact or determine if they're working or not? Is there a way that we're able to measure that or see that they're visible in any certain confidence level?
Say one is deploying the Entromy survey. So, if we're trying to address some of the issues, I think deploying 6 to 12 months later, one form of measurement. Two, we as try to be an accountability partner. So we're not fans of the one and done, show up, have a session, and then kind of run off into the sunset. And so, maybe on a monthly cadence coming out of one of those meetings, checking in with the CEO, a subset of the ELT or the entire ELT around, what progress have we made? And then depending on what it is that we're trying to address, to the degree that we can identify measurable results, impacts on the business, KPIs, looking to see if we've been able to move the needle there. So it really depends on kind of what the opportunity is. But I think it is kind of accountability 101. It's, let's deploy the Entromy survey at some timeline down the road. And in the interim, let's Summit be an accountability partner to make sure that things are moving along. In some cases, we might be supporting them by helping facilitate some of these focus groups that do the double click on areas that they're less clear about or more surprised on. And then again, circling back and where possible, measuring the results of the actions that the team has decided to prioritize.
So, Rob, I'm trying to understand, you're on this debrief call, you've got the CEO there, you're delivering maybe some not so rosy news about their business being in the bottom quartile. What was maybe the initial reaction? And then how did that CEO end up reflecting and maybe even internalizing those next steps? Because I would imagine there's a process, like you've kind of alluded to, of, hey, let's take some time to absorb and not just make a knee-jerk reaction. But I'm just wondering if you could walk us through kind of that process with the CEO.
Yeah, in this particular case, again, really applaud the CEO. Again, despite the results not being what I think any company would want, it was less of a surprise and more validating what he and the team probably suspected given all the change that was going on. One of the things in this particular case that he did soon after the survey, I believe it was soon after the survey, is, again, let me just kind of connect this. One of the pieces of feedback is we're not clear on the strategic direction of the company. We also don't feel like communication is where it needs to be deeper into the organization. So the CEO sent out an all company communication explaining some of the changes that had taken place, introducing, they actually reorganized the organizational structure a little bit into 2 business units, communicating that and the rationale, who the leadership was, introducing some of the other new leaders that hadn't maybe been as broadly introduced to the organization, and then also reminding folks of what was kind of staying the same. And the CEO, I think, was particularly effective at kind of recognizing, again, he was a relatively new CEO, so in role for less than a year, that it is going to be a process of kind of communication and then recommunication to begin helping people broader in the organization make sense of the changes that were taking place. I mean, he and the team were clear, like there's still parts of the strategy we need to try to figure out and potentially kind of even continue to evolve. And that was one of the next steps in the process. So one of the ways that we suggested we could work with them is to do one of those half-day sessions to do that. But the good news in this particular case is, despite the results, they weren't surprising. And this particular CEO, I think, had a very he had, I think, a good capability around how do we engage and communicate what we can while we're still trying to figure some of this stuff out and go through this transition.
Yeah, so a CEO that's, relatively new, getting an Entromy survey on their organization, some CEOs might be reticent to that sort of transparency because how are they supposed to be held accountable when they sort of just got there? But this particular CEO sounds like there was a desire to just understand, to say, hey, kind of almost raise their hand to say, well, it's really going to be tough to improve if I don't even know what's going on and I need to get a little bit of a baseline. Is that sort of the feel that you got from this CEO?
I think you hit the nail on the head. That was exactly it. It was like, and I applaud, I really appreciate that quality in CEOs when, they're relatively new to role and, I'm a blank slate. I want to, again, this CEO had been in place about 8 or 9 months, actually, and nine months, and was already getting a sense himself, obviously getting out there. This particular case, he's a charismatic CEO. I think he's somebody who really does value kind of engagement with folks. So again, I felt like this data was probably more validating and reaffirming of what he'd already kind of picked up on to say, hey, let's have some concrete data behind this. And then let's use this concrete data as a starting point to think about how do we need to prioritize this? And, I can share in this particular case what some of the priorities were coming out of it, right? So I've mentioned this before, there's opportunity around strategic alignment. There was this opportunity around getting to know the leadership team and communicating more consistently and effectively. So, the note that he sent out, I think, was a good first step in that direction. There's the integration piece of it. How is that integration going to go? And what impact is that going to have on culture? We haven't talked much about culture on this call, but, when you're integrating companies, trying to provide, as much, consistency across kind of the new go forward culture is a challenge for any organization. There was recognition, the survey results confirmed that was an opportunity. And so again, it was more reaffirming than it was, brand new insights. And so then the next step in this is to say, great, lots of opportunity. We think we have a decent sense around where we want to focus our attention. I think the next step in the process is let's, get the next iteration of our strategy where it needs to be. Let's figure out, okay, are there other pieces of this data that we have that would inform us? We need to focus on other things above and beyond our initial assessment because we think there are risks to potentially executing the strategy.
So, Rob, I know that you and the Summit team have been using Entromy for quite a while in your engagements. I'm wondering if you could maybe be just a little reflective for a moment and think about what advice you might give other consultants using Entromy or other CEOs considering Entromy, because in some cases there might be a little bit of apprehension around that level of insight, but I'm wondering what sort of advice you could give others maybe considering Entromy.
In some projects, for a number of projects that we do, we have found disconnects between where an executive leadership team might think the opportunities are and what we're hearing deeper into the organization. So one of the reasons that we're big fans of Entromy and we use it is because it gives us insight around these different levels of these different levers of organizational performance where a leadership, even a leadership team has blind spots. And so Entromy is one great use of Entromy is to identify where there might be blind spots in terms of, performance levers in the organization, that for whatever reason, the senior team is not as maybe aware of or as sensitive to. Secondly, I think, while the OHB isn't an engagement survey, it's different than an engagement survey. I think employees, for the most part, value the fact that they're getting a chance to speak their mind, both quantitatively and in the open comments. And then the responsibility shifts back to the executive leadership team to actually do something with that and communicate to the organization what we're doing. And, the mistake I see companies make is they do the survey, it's helpful, insightful, and then it gets kind of put on a shelf and we'll redo it again next year. And employees are like, okay, I keep answering the survey and I don't see much. That's frustrating for an employee to experience. But, the teams, and I feel like the one we're talking about today is a great example of that, took the data very seriously, wants to action on it. It took some short-term actions that I think were the right ones to take, but at the same time are saying, hey, we're going to revisit this, and this will be a key input to our priorities in terms of organizational health and organizational performance, so that, again, coming always back to the North Star, our strategy or our value creation plan.
So, Rob, I wanted to talk just for a moment about this acceleration factor that our firms provide in Unison, because, Entromy is this technology platform. We're a management insights platform. And obviously, Summit does a great job in kind of taking that report and really adding that attribution and that context to some of the findings to determine an action plan. So I'm going to ask about the acceleration factor here in just a second, but I pulled an interesting quote from their CEO. The CEO said, Entromy didn't just surface issues. It actually gave us confidence to prioritize where leadership alignment had to start. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to that just for a moment in terms of that acceleration, because they might have been able to figure that out eventually, but it wasn't without a little bit of lift from your end and our end in unison to provide that clarity. I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah. So I would guess what he was referring to there are some of the quick win opportunities that they went after, right? So it was, okay, the strategic alignment was going to take a little bit longer. There was more work that had to be done there. But what did they knew that they had to communicate more effectively, hence the genesis of that note, right? I mean, I think he was probably already thinking about that communication before, but it just, again, this Entromy survey, I think, reaffirmed the need to do that. The cultural piece of it, I think, again, recognized that even more change management around the integration of the acquisition was something they really needed to focus on because it was impacting not only operationally, but the culture of the go forward organization. And so, I think looking at that, at the data, said, hey, what are the quick wins we can go after to start moving the needle? And then let's continue to be thoughtful around what are the other opportunities once we are really aligned on kind of what the next iteration of the strategy is. I will say, my experience with this particular organization is, again, I think it was driven by a relatively new CEO who was very driven in terms of what his plan was for the next couple years, so to speak, and was not afraid to take some immediate actions that seemed like almost no-brainers to do, while being more thoughtful around strategically how do we take advantage of this data as well.
That's great, Rob. Thank you for that great summary. That really does a great job of putting this talk in a little bit of a bow. I want to give you one more opportunity if there's any final thoughts, maybe things that we didn't touch on that we should have in this engagement. I found it really fascinating to watch not just the data come to life, but really to then be applied and attributed to some of those next steps within that organization. So any final closing thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of frameworks. I think frameworks help, just are a great organizing model. And so with this particular team, the last thing I'll close on is that we shared a framework that we use at Summit a lot, that is really around organizational performance. And it starts with strategic alignment, which we've talked a lot about on this call. And it then moves to, are we clear on the talent and capabilities that we need to be able to execute that strategy? How are we organizing those talent and capabilities, which is the organizational structure? And then there's the operating model. How's work getting done? And so that model is really, really helpful. What we do is we overlay that to the Entromy results and to say, okay, if these are all the things that an organization needs to do and the rank for around it is culture, let's see where those opportunities are, where the biggest opportunities are against those different pieces of organizational performance. And let's then try to prioritize, do we want to prioritize talent and capability, structure, operating model? It's usually a combination of all of that aligned to the strategy that's going to give us the uplift we need to be able to execute and perform.
That's great. Rob, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for your partnership. We're really just excited about the future working together and this company being set up for success. I really appreciate your insights.
Likewise, we really appreciate your partnership. You guys are a core part of, all the organizational work that we do. And so, yeah, thank you for this opportunity for this conversation.
Great. Hope you have a great day.
You too.